So hello everyone, this is our next Hangout in our series on Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus. And we are starting on Chapter 5, which is Background Knowledge for Context, and about Element 23. And did anybody have any questions on what went on before we get going?
I don't. It's nice to see you guys.
Yep. Okay. I personally don't have much commentary on these points. I'm kind of willing to accept what Carrier says, so I need some of you guys to be more critical for me. But yeah, these are just basically a sentence or two to summarize each section of Carrier has. But I could be summarizing 5 or 6 pages in one of these comments here, so this really is squishing things down. Element 23, the Romans annexed Judea to the imperial province of Syria in 6 CE, bringing the center of the Holy Land under direct control of the Roman government, ending Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem and the temple of the Most High God, along with most of the Holy Land that had been promised by God to the Jews. I don't see anything questionable there, but anybody else have any comments on that section?
The sovereignty thing is a little bit. I mean, obviously the Romans had the control, but they didn't come in and assign, a new king that was a Roman. They actually let Herod, who was the half Jewish and half Idumean king, kind of rule over the place as long as he was loyal to them.
So they didn't have complete sovereignty.
Right. But they hadn't had any complete sovereignty. They had a sovereignty for a couple of years under the Maccabeans, but that wasn't much. And so they were used to not having sovereignty over the land by this point in history.
But there's evidence they weren't happy with that state of affairs, though.
Oh, of course, yeah. Who would be?
Yeah.
Well, element 23 is setting up for a lot of things to come, and the basic point that I think he's making is the cognitive dissonance point about the promises to Israel and the subjugation that actually resulted. So that is an undercurrent that's going to flow. It's at the source of all the rebellions, the minor ones, the major ones, but also at the heart of messianic expectation.
Messianism, yeah.
And how the different flavors of it are all responses to this historical situation.
So actually, a good question would be, when do the first hints of messianism show up in the historical record?
I was just going to ask that same question. Is there any hint of that prior to Governor Cyrenius, or at this 6 AD benchmark? Is there anything prior to that in the annals that indicates?
There are those who say that it's contained in Daniel and it's contained in Isaiah, but of course that's a little bit circular. But right. other than the Old Testament,
I'm not all that expert on the history of the Maccabean period. I mean, what happened then? Can you give me a quick summary?
The Maccabees kind of had a little bit of revolt, and they established for lack of a better word, a Jewish kingdom. It was.
So that's long before this annexation we're talking about here, though.
Yeah, you know the story of Hanukkah?
Roughly.
Well, the story of Hanukkah dates to the Maccabean period, and it refers to when they ran out of oil during a siege or something.
And when do you think that was? 100 BC? 200 BC?
I'd have to look it up, but it's Reuven. Without looking it up, Reuven. Ask Reuven. He would be more read in this stuff.
Reuben wrote in the side chat,
There
well,
you
of
go.
course, the concept is in the Old Testament regarding messianism, and the Maccabees were a group of priests who made themselves kings over a small piece of the land, later expanding it through reconquest in about the 160s BCE.
Yeah, but they did reach. They did reach Jerusalem in the heart of the heart of Judea.
So, but who were they? Who were they conquering? Just the local rulers, or I mean, Rome didn't have a hand at that time in that area, then, right?
Correct.
Oh, the Seleucids. Okay, that's part of why I get confused about that history. Is who they're fighting against keeps changing.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that the Judeans they had a few years with the Maccabees and then a couple of years with Bar Kokhba, but they never really had any sovereignty until 1947.
Okay, element
What about,
24.
before we move on, uh, somebody mentioned 6 CE. That was the Judas the Galilean revolt. That was basically a tax revolt, right?
Well, Carrier mentions 6 CE. That's
Yeah.
directly in the book.
Yeah, that's a reference to that Judas the Galilean, who coincidentally was in full revolt at the time of supposedly Jesus' birth, according to Luke, thereabouts.
But
Right.
6CE is to my understanding, 6CE is also important because that's when that's when Octavian, I think, granted the rule or took over. And
Yeah,
they
that's what
granted,
Carrier's getting at. Is that's when the Romans acted against that area.
right.
Well, not really against. I mean, from the Roman point of view, they'd be acting for the area, but I mean, the locals might have a different interpretation of things.
But, the revolt was ruthlessly crushed, so, it's not going to be at all favorable to the locals.
Okay, element 24. Owing to their vastly greater resources in materials, money, and manpower, and superior technical ability in training, equipping, and supplying of their armies, the Romans were effectively invincible and could never be expelled from Judea by force or diplomacy. This fact was so empirically evident and publicly tested and demonstrated on such a wide scale that it had become evident to at least some Jews, even while many either didn't see it, denied it, even when seen, or imagined celestial aid would redress the imbalance.
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things about Roman history is that they were so advanced that they were, for all intents and purposes, invincible. Do you remember the movie? I'm sure some of you do. Gladiator.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sequence
I've
in
never
there
actually seen it.
well, it's set during the reign.
Spoiler alert.
It's set during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and he's kind of considered one of the pacifist. Well, not quite pacifist, but one of the nicer, wiser,
More reflective?
more reflective emperors. He wrote a magnificent book, actually. But the film, I think, is kind of a stupid film. It won the Best Picture Oscar. I have no idea why. But there's the opening scene where it shows the Romans laying siege to a place, and it's fascinating. If you watch it, just watch it for that one thing, because you could see it. The Romans were just invincible.
I'm not sure how you pronounce this. Excuse me. It's Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic.
Pyrrhic.
Yeah, when they say a Pyrrhic victory, you know what they're referring to.
It
There was
means
yeah,
fire.
Well, yeah, there's a Greek general that was constantly at war with Rome, and he won every time, but he had a famous statement, and I'm trying to think of what it was. It's like, um,
Where it's like you win
look
the
it up.
battle, but you win the battle, but you lose 50,000 men in the process or something.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
you can't afford to have those kind of victories.
Yeah.
So, in effect, even if you were victorious against Rome, I think Carrier makes that point. Even if you were
Yeah.
victorious, it still didn't help you any.
On page 154, Courier quotes it as "one more victory and I'm done for."
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. Let me see if I can find my Kindle.
So I'll move on to the next element. The corruption and moral decay of the Jewish civil and temple elite, regardless of to what extent it was actual or merely perceived, was a widespread target of condemnation and often a cause of factionalizing among Jewish sects. Now, I can't remember the exact documents, but I remember even years ago, even before reading Carrier, that I was seeing that among, reading Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, that there's a lot of stuff that's anti-temple in them.
Well, yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the best indicator of that trend. Which it was a trend which continued on until the 66 to 70, the Second Revolt. You want me to read the next one, Wayne? You want to take turns so you don't burn yourself out?
Yeah,
Do you
sure.
do you guys think
Coffee,
that?
so.
Do you
Okay.
think that his statement that where it says that it was he's kind of getting at it's inevitable that there was going to be a conflict?
What,
Do I think
element
that
24?
do I think that
Yeah,
carriers? Do I think the carrier's setting that up?
I think he actually kind of says that at the very end. He says like Roman military might plus Jewish military messianism equals the inevitable destruction of the Jews.
Yeah, I think he's saying that the Jews, or at least certain sects or portions of that population there, knew the writing was on the wall, and it kind of set the flavor, for the theology that, gave birth to.
It's just interesting though that Pax Romana, and all the peoples that were subjugated accepted it and benefited from it. That in this one little hotbed, it's just not working out.
Well, it was working out pretty good for a while. I mean, you had little flare-ups, which happened everywhere. But I think for the most part,
I don't know about you guys, but little flare-ups end up leading to something worse.
But the Romans kept bringing graven eagles into the temple. And that sounds like something you'd laugh at now. I mean, that was a serious problem for some of the Jews back then.
yeah. But I don't know. I think that the Judeans were very tolerant to some degree, but I think it's a matter of volition. Like for instance, when you have a synagogue and you decorate it with the zodiac, you did that yourself, and so you have no objection. But when the emperor forces eagles onto your temple, then that's a different story.
So you're kind of saying that overall, had not certain factions or factors gone into it, that it probably would have gone a totally different way?
Well, I think that messing with the temple was like stirring up hornet's nest. Yeah.
Do you think the Romans understood that, or do you think they were
No, well, when that happened, it was under Caligula, and in the sense that Caligula was the representative of Rome. No, I don't think the Romans understood that. I think Caligula was insane.
And also through the history, there seems to be a lot of provocation where the Roman handling of the various situations, were definitely insensitive to Jewish sensibilities and so forth. Maybe they were just applying a general kind of policy without specific, without tailoring it to every situation, I would imagine. But yeah, there was things that they did that would, were deliberately done in order to provoke. Maybe they didn't expect it to be that serious, but it did.
Well, Caligula wanted to be a living god. I think one of the things that might have changed the course of history would have been had different people become emperor at a given point. Like you had people who were completely insane, like Caligula and possibly Nero, and then you had people who had some sense about them, like Claudius,
who expelled the Jews from Rome.
Yeah, but nevertheless, he did have some sense about him. He wasn't completely insane.
I'm just wondering what would happen if Caligula had not died when he did, and that he had carried through with his plans. I'm just wondering exactly what would have happened.
And mind you, there are two conflicting stories about the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. Cassius Dio says one thing, and Suetonius says something else, and so it's not a clear cut. I'd have to look it up now. I don't have it in front of me, but I remember that being the case.
Cool.
The element 26, for many Jews in the early 1st century, the Jewish elite became the scapegoats for God's failed promises. The reason God withheld their fulfillment and instead allowed the Romans to rule was imagined to be the Jewish elite's failure to keep God's commandments and govern justly.
I could see that being a fashionable Judean sentiment.
Yeah, that sentiment is echoed in the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, it sounds like something Jeremiah would have said.
And there's some commentators like R.G. Price who read the Gospel of Mark allegorically, and this is a major point he brings up in how it's read out allegorically, that Mark's actually implying this, according to R.G. Price. That like Judas betraying Jesus is actually standing for the Jews betraying themselves, with the Romans.
Yeah, sycophants are never popular.
Even Herod, I think Herod the Great was seen as a Roman puppet, but he took it upon himself. A lot of people don't know this, but it was him who built the temple, and he built Antiochus, not Antiochus. Is it Antiochus Maritima or whatever it is, whatever. Anyway, he built a lot of the huge building projects that were undertaken during this period. Herod was responsible for, and he did such a good job that a lot of these places are still standing and are really impressive. But nevertheless, he was seen as a Roman puppet sycophant as well. They used to call him a half-breed.
Yeah, I spent a lot of money also on the Gentile cities as well. Yeah. But it's like how often have you tried to buy somebody's favor? I'm not talking about us, but figures of history, trying to buy a favor by spending money, but just not working.
Reuven is saying that the Herod's temple had more of a circular role than a religious one. I don't really understand what you mean by that, Reuven, considering that was the center of the sacrificial cult. about the money changers?
And of course, the whole purpose of the money changers was to solve the problem of idolatry on the Roman coins,
Right.
because we couldn't have the graven images inside the temple, so we had to switch to money that doesn't have the images on them.
Yeah, but that had a religious function.
And of course, the fringe groups that basically saw the whole temple, the cult, the priesthood as illegitimate, you know, not, well, what Carrier's saying basically. But you know, who are these people? It's the dissatisfaction of the common man with the elite, right? Because they're seeing all this temple sacrifice, even if it wasn't secular, even if it was religious, it's impure religiousness, right?
Well, that was the whole function of the money changers, was to not taint the inner sanctum.
Right, and the priests that were actually there were like political appointees, right there.
And the money changer were probably charging outrageous interest for their services in swifting the common man.
Well, we don't know that. That's a speculation. We could speculate that, but we don't know that.
If they strictly followed the Jewish law, they couldn't do that because it prohibits charging fellow Jews interest. But whether that was actually followed at that point in time is a whole different question.
And would also be where they were located in the temple. For instance, they could have been non-Jews, like in the court of the nation or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the court of the Gentiles or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
But nevertheless, yeah, I think it's from the texts that we have, I think that Carrier is correct in making this point, that there was a trend, which was a growing trend, if the lead up to the Second Revolt is any indication, that people were starting to blame the Jerusalem elite for their troubles, let's say.
But so, what was the common person considering the situation troublesome, or is this just an upper class complaint?
No, I think it probably extended into the hinterland. I don't think the revolt would have had any. I think the revolt wouldn't have any teeth if it didn't involve the populace.
I mean, how would it affect their daily lives then, being under Roman rule? I mean,
Taxes.
Okay.
Taxes.
A lot of times, what it seems like popular movements, revolts and Jerusalem Spring, that kind of stuff. It's dissatisfaction and alienation of one elite by another, where they kind of ride some kind of populist dissatisfaction or whatever, and use it as a weapon to seize power from another elite group without there actually being any real grassroots appeal. They're just opportunists in a lot of ways.
John Dominic Crossan actually kind of stresses some of this stuff in his, I think it's The Origin of Christianity, The Birth of Christianity, and also in his big historical Jesus book, which I forget what it's called now, probably The Historical Jesus, where he discusses the position, the laments of the peasantry. He kind of he talks about what the peasants would have felt about the taxing situation, and he goes as far as to specify that when the New Testament talks about the poor, he doesn't mean just the poor, he means the destitute. He means those whose lands and everything have been taken away. by the powers that be. And so, at least according to Crossan, the problem was a very widespread one.
Of that I'm sure.
It's a little off the subject, but you just reminded me of a passage that's commonly misinterpreted by Christians. I just wanted to comment on. I forget in which book this is in, but when Jesus says, one will be taken but another left, a lot of Christians read that as, as being taken as the good one. God will take all the good people for the rapture and stuff, and everybody who got, who hasn't been a Christian gets left behind and stuff. But in the original context of that verse, taken probably means taken into slavery, and the people who are left are the fortunate ones.
Yeah, I read that somewhere too. I can't recall where. I think it was a blog post or something.
Taken. How does this relate to the element?
It doesn't, but something you said just made it come to mind. And it relates to how the Romans were treating people, like in 70 and stuff. A lot of the Jews, Jews were kicked out of the city, but some of the more troublesome Jews were taken elsewhere into the Roman Empire to live the rest of their lives as slaves. That's not talked about a lot, but that's kind of what happened.
Let's see. Should I read the next one?
Sure.
The temple at Jerusalem was the central focus of most Jewish messianic hopes, as for the Samaritans was Mount Gerizim, which entailed that as long as the corrupt Jewish elite controlled it, God would continue Israel's punishment. And as long as the Romans remained in power, they would maintain the corrupt Jewish elite's control of the temple. Accordingly, Jewish religious violence often aimed at seizing physical control of the temple and its personnel. Let me read that again.
Yeah. That's almost a complete paragraph from the book. I only took out like references to previous elements.
Yeah, I was reading that paragraph in the book, and I go, whoa, maybe he's reading a different version of it. Then I remembered, oh, that's right, he's reading the notes.
But I mean, that's one of the problems that's reflected in the writings of Josephus, for instance, is that often some kind of there'd be some kind of I don't want to say a revolt, but some kind of a demonstration against the Romans having appointed someone that they didn't like, And so, yeah, what Carrier is saying here was definitely a factor. Which also brings up the question of just how where does the rubber meet the road as far as the hinterland, the peasantry and the regular folk. How did it affect their lives? And it's almost like I'm trying to envision another scenario, like supposing Hitler would have appointed a pope, or Mussolini would have appointed a pope. How do you think the people would have reacted?
Yeah, I get you. Good analogy.
And I think it definitely was a factor to turn people away, not necessarily away from the sacrificial cult, because the sacrificial cult kept going because people are kind of addicted to their religious habits. But they did it grudgingly.
Well, I don't know how pervasive the sacrificial cult. I just forgot what word you used, and my brain just slipped. The sacrificial cult actually was, though. I mean, we know it happened, and the temple was a busy place and stuff. But we also know that even as back as the book of Jeremiah, that he's saying God never asked for animal sacrifices. So we know there was a strain of Judaism, for centuries that didn't like the sacrificial cult.
Do you think they could have? Do you know if the Essenes did that? Sacrificed animals?
No, there's one, the Essenes, there's one thread of data, I think it's from Philo, that claims that the Essenes were vegetarians, and it might have been because of their opposition to the sacrificial cult.
Do you think it's possible that the Essenes were more sympathetic to the Jeremiah strand of Judaism?
Possibly. That's a good point.
There's also the idea that they were like a priesthood in waiting. They were waiting to someday seize the temple for themselves and perform the sacrifices piously, cleanly, the way they're supposed to be. So, and they were just holy warriors waiting for their chance.
But even though the hinterland kind of might have had problems with the sacrificial cult and the link to Roman rule, it kind of reminds me of the Muslim practice where they go to Mecca once a year, and I think that even during this period,
Once a lifetime.
Once a lifetime. But I think that the same was the true for the Jews, and they had such celebrations at least 2-3 times a year. I mean, you'd have to. Definitely for Passover was one of them.
And about the vegetarian angle, there are grain offerings mentioned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy also. So, I mean, that was somehow accounted for from the onset.
Sure.
Although we also have the story of Cain and Abel where the grain offering wasn't accepted by God, so maybe there's some pushback against that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that was Cain's offering, and I think that might have been one of the reasons why the sacrificial cult in Jerusalem focused so much on pigeons and lambs and things of that sort.
And then the author of those stories it's either they were outside the cult or pre-cult or whatever, but that wasn't a big thing for them. That was added mainly by the priestly writers, naturally. But for the Yahwists, supposedly the source critics that wrote the story of Cain and Abel, it wasn't, the sacrificial cult wasn't anything like it was for the priests, so,
No, but also that's not the Cain and Abel story is one link, but there's also the Noah link where after the flood, he lands on Mount Ararat, and one of the first things he does is build a fire, sacrifice one of the animals. I think it was a lamb or a ram or something, and
more than one actually.
Yeah, but the book I remember specifically said something along the lines of, and God was pleased by the smell of the sacrifice, and so God loves the smell of burning meat, according to that story.
Yeah, the whole flood story is a composite, though, so that part comes from the priestly writer.
Sure.
Which makes sense, right?
And then
he proceeded to get drunk.
Yeah, which is another vegetarian part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he becomes a farmer. The agriculturalist.
Yeah, and if you read the Yahweh story contiguously, you're going from practically soon after Cain and Abel, they have the genealogy of Cain, right? And he's all these sons and that. And you can almost say that all that other stuff you can skip and go directly to Noah, and that's the continuation of the story, that what was the sin of Adam at the beginning where he's cursed in the land and all that. And then when Noah's born, as a continuation of that story, I don't want to get too far off field, but they say we'll call him Noah because he'll bring relief, from the problems we're having with agriculture. So you might say that, the idea that Genesis, what is it, 3, was like the proto-evangelion, the proto-gospel, prophesying Jesus. Really, it's fulfilled by Noah, because you can skip all that stuff that kind of distracts you from that point by eliminating the other sources and just looking at a contiguous story. And you can see that it goes, there's a lot of problems where the land is cursed, but here comes Noah. He's able to finally remove the curse from the land by being able to grow grapes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I first noticed that, I thought when I was reading the book of Jay, but it turns out that they don't make that connection, that I had to go through Richard Elliott Friedman, the way he has divided up to actually see that. So.
Yep.
Anywho.
We're ready for element 28. A spiritual solution to the physical conundrum of the Jews would have been a natural and easy thing to conceive at the time. But if any Jews had realized that such a reconquest was impossible, but still sought a means to escape their cognitive dissonance without denying the evident facts or abandoning deep-seated religious beliefs, then for them only one solution remained: to deny the physical importance of the temple at Jerusalem itself. That would require replacing it, not with another temple, but with something intangible, which neither the Romans nor the corrupt Jewish elite could control, and which required neither money nor material power to bring about or maintain, and whose ruler was himself incapable of corruption.
This is where I have a hang-up.
I'm glad you said that and not me. Go on. Explain why.
I don't know if this is your line of thinking, but I've been struggling with trying to, with the chronology of when the spiritual temple notion popped up. Was it pre-destruction of the temple or post-destruction of the temple? And I'm just wondering how feasible it is to think that this notion, we're talking about the book of Hebrews being pre-70, the Pauline's pre-70, at least according to Carrier's thesis.
Yeah, well, I disagree with that, but continue.
Right, that's what I'm saying, but going with that, I'm not sure I agree with it either. And I just have a hard time. Maybe I don't necessarily have a scholarly reason for it. It's just a thing where I'm just trying to make sense of this framework, this theological framework, taking off while that temple is still erect right there in Jerusalem. Even though they may have seen the writing on the wall, it just doesn't pass the sniff test to me that they would absolutely wholesale abandon it. And when I read Hebrews, I don't see that they are necessarily repudiating a physical temple that is present. I kind of see a retrospective approach saying, I don't know, maybe that's what I'm reading into the text, but I just have a hard time believing that a sect of Judaism could embrace a holy spiritual temple while that building is still standing there.
I kind of agree with you on that, and I also another point that I would add is that in this element in the last in the outline, the last sentence where it says that would require replacing it not with another temple with something intangible, I don't see how that's necessarily so. I think that it's a good speculation, and it's a good it's a tenable solution to the problem, but I don't see how it would require replacing it with some intangible thing like this.
I agree. I tend to think that Hebrews, for example, is a retrospective rendering as opposed to a prospective solution to the inevitable, as Carrier is characterizing it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and against Carrier on that. Yeah.
I have a point. I have a point about this, but I have to go chase my bird down real quick. So before he gets stuck up in the rafters of the house where we can't get to him.
All right, go for
So just a few minutes.
Who was talking earlier ago before John and Leon? Was that Dostin?
Yeah, this is Goldstein.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Dostin. When I have the outline up as a screen share, at the bottom of the screen where we normally say who's talking, it covers up the indicators, so I can't tell who's talking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's just part of how Google designs stuff. It's just poor design on their part.
Yeah, I know. It's yeah, I have that objection also, but luckily there are few enough of us that I kind of get to know everybody's voice more or less.
Yeah. Well, I know it now. I just hadn't heard Dawson enough before to have it memorized.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I understand your reservations about this point, and I think you're taking it too far, though.
In what sense?
That this is just kind of an undercurrent to people's thoughts is what Carrie was kind of saying. You know, it's something that'd be naturally kind of naturally following, but didn't necessarily people act on it. You're right, the physical temple is really there. People aren't going to act on it. But this kind of, this kind of wishing the temple wasn't something corruptible could be a feeling that a lot of people did share when the temple was there. And once it was destroyed, it was already, something that they're already thinking, so it could pretty much be acted on quickly afterwards.
That I agree with, and that makes sense to me. I was just, my point was assuming as I think Carrier's thesis assumes, the traditional dates for the Paulines and the Hebrews letter.
I think he's doing that mostly. I mean, he does agree the early dates himself. That is his position, but he's doing that here to argue a fortiori, though. He doesn't want to have too many different issues with the people he's arguing against.
Agreed.
So he's accepting that because that's what most of the scholarship accepts, that he doesn't want to challenge every single thing.
Right,
Sure.
for the sake of argument. I understand. Yeah.
I get that too, and I mean, to add a little bit of weight to what Wayne said also is the establishment of the community at Qumran, for instance, reflects some of this feeling of the temple not being quote unquote the real temple.
Yeah.
Even at the founding of the Qumran community, it possibly was founded on that very principle. How spiritual, quote unquote, the temple was is arguable.
Yeah.
So are we pretty much on the same wavelength in thinking that the actual notion of this Jesus the Christ is post 70 AD in its origins?
Are you asking me?
Anybody, you or just in general, just want to get a sense of what the group thinks about where the actual notion of Jesus the Christ.
I tend to think that Jesus the Christ was kind of an outgrowth of a previous Joshua kind of a cult.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that the Jesus the Christ proper is a post-70 phenomenon, let's call it.
Okay. Well,
I have to think about it more myself.
With that said, other than that, notwithstanding that little hiccup from me, that little minor issue, I follow and agree mostly with Carrier's setting of the table, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the issues that I'm having with this particular Hangout, this book series of Hangouts, is that I'm almost entirely convinced that Carrier's correct in his general thesis, but I've been having little issues with some of the minutia and some of the details.
Mm-hmm.
So I relate to what you're saying there.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's because he, with his elements, he's speaking, they're very, they're brief, he's maybe if he spent some more time, I mean, the book is already massive, but if he, fleshed out some of those ideas a little further, maybe they would, we would follow them more. Like, for example, in Element 23, he uses the term sovereignty, and we kind of said, okay, actually, that's kind of stretching it because there wasn't much sovereignty if we really think about it. I don't know if he was able to flesh out that term or what he meant by that. Maybe he meant exactly what you articulated when you took issue with the term, but he just used the wrong term to capture that idea. I don't know, but I think with the elements, he kind of skims the surface, setting the table. I don't know if that's why.
He does skim the surface because the problem is he cites so much work in the footnotes. That's
Right.
basically where he gets all that from.
Right.
And there's just so many sources cited.
Yeah.
It almost seems like each not necessarily elements, but each group of elements deserves almost its own monograph.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And you got to hand it to Carrier for even tackling such a huge umbrella heading. It's like it's a 700-page book.
Yeah.
And like for me, my biggest issue with it is his acceptance of the Pauline corpus, the acceptance of the 7 authentic Pauline letters, which in my mind he does completely uncritically in this book. If he has a reason for accepting these as genuine, he never gives a reason for it. And I had an issue actually recently on the Bible Geek listeners page where some commenter, I brought up this issue and the commenter basically said something to the effect of, well, everybody knows that. It's based on internal evidence and it's based on this, that, and the other thing. And I said to her, well, please recommend a book to me which makes this case, because I will not accept everybody knows this, quote unquote, as an argument.
My problem with the Pauline scholarship is too many people don't make their first step separating out the Catholic interpretations from the original version that was in Marcion's Bible.
Right.
And they make arguments, over which of the letters were authentic and which are not based on them as a whole. But if they're looking at stuff that's from the interpolations later, that's going to throw them off track.
Right, but
agreed.
But of course, Wayne, there's also the inbuilt problem there where most people are not even going to take you up on the idea that Marcion's came first.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
so there's a huge
That's why I have a problem
there.
with it, though. Yeah, that's why I have a problem with it. So
yeah, and I think that's a can of worms. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you go. I forgot what I was saying.
No, I just think that, as someone mentioned it before, I think it's a can of worms that he didn't want to open up because his thesis already is kind of controversial, if you will, and he's trying to. I think he was using this book as a means to kind of confront the consensus in a manner that could be taken serious. So, I think he was throwing a bone to the mainstream by granting the authenticity of the 7 big letters.
Do you think? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and so with that said, doing so, because the book could have been twice as long if he really wanted to tackle the authenticity of the letters and address the issues of interpolations, which I think was relevant to his thesis because he spends a lot of time trying to address the whole Galatians 1:18 issue, when in fact that may not have even been original to the text.
Exactly.
And frankly, I think the argument for interpolation is more convincing when you look at all the relevant evidence, textual evidence.
Yeah. The argument for interpolation in particular passages may not be that great, but the argument for interpolation as an overall pattern is immense.
Right, absolutely. And I think he didn't even address that. I think he would have done himself a service if he would have even addressed that issue, but he sidestepped it altogether, which made me wonder if he was aware of it and found himself guilty of his own criticism of other scholars, that he kind of gives the benefit of the doubt to making, conceding mainstream consensus when in fact it's not warranted.
Thank you. I'm with you on that, and I think that, but I will say though, in his defense, and to back up what Wayne just said though, is it has to do with the a fortiori aspect of it, where it's just for the sake of argument. Let's say that the 7 letters are authentic, then it would mean this particular scenario is at play. You see what I'm saying? And I think that in that sense, it kind of makes sense of his argument, but there is that problem, and I think it should have been addressed. I agree with you on that.
But if they're not authentic, it just makes it even worse for historicity.
Do you think a thesis could still hold even if he holds your views of the Pauline letters, Leon?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Do you think his thesis would hold if just say he adopts the Dettering view of inauthentic Pauline letters?
No.
What do you mean by the Dettering view?
The view that you hold, that there's no authentic letters.
Yeah, I kind of see it more as a Dutch radical view, but I think I've said this before. I think that it would make the prior probabilities even less, and would, in some sense,
probability for historicity even less.
It would make probability for historicity even less. Yes.
But do you think his view would still hold?
Well, no. I mean, his particular case kind of requires Pauline authenticity and Hebrew's early status.
So what would change? What would change? In the mythicist model.
I would need a moment to kind of think about this.
Well, if I can give a thought to it, I think these carriers, I think historicity itself would be, or before saying that, I think Carrier's particular thesis does not hold up if those are not authentic. And the reason why I think that is because part of his thesis argues that the earliest version of Christianity was presupposed a holy celestial being, and that this real person of Paul existed and knew nothing about a real Jesus. So So if we say Paul was not real, or that Paul didn't write these letters that we're basing this notion on, then his thesis kind of it doesn't work anymore. It must.
But we still have the situation where whoever wrote the letters, if it wasn't Paul, is still using a lot of language that sounds like a mystery religion. Is still using a lot of language that seems to be talking about a celestial Christ. I mean, I
agree, but one could argue that could have been 2nd century. One could argue that could be,
Yeah, but I think a really strong case could be made, however, that whoever wrote them, and whoever multiple authors wrote them, it still reflects an early Christianity. I think that is true. But I'd like to add a point here about, just off the top of my head, in answer to Dave Mack's question. I think that the most important thing is that if we cannot date, if we don't know the dating or the provenance of the Pauline corpus, then it basically means that we have no reliable primary sources on any of this stuff.
Correct.
And that's a huge can of worms.
That's what Price says. I mean, that's kind of where he comes from. But, that's...
Yeah. But we still have a situation where by the late 2nd century we have writings that have a lot of weird ideas in them that don't jive with each other. Some talking about historical Christ and some using language that just doesn't fit with an historical Christ. So I mean, the documents themselves are showing evidences of a mythicist camp existing. Regardless of when we're saying it existing, whether it's 1st or 2nd century, it's in the texts.
Well, we can to some degree reliably date Marcion, right? And if Marcion is in the early 2nd century to about 144, when he was supposedly excommunicated, then at least that gives us an idea of Paul came before that. And I should say Paul, the epistles came before that. And it doesn't matter who wrote them, if it was multiple authors, which I think it was. But at least it is some of the earliest examples of Christian thinking that we do have. And so Carrier's thesis does stand. If we consider this the earliest examples, then the thesis would actually still stand, but not in the same sense, not in the same way.
Yeah, not in the same way, because, I mean, even if we say, okay, the Paulines were written, late 1st century, so were arguably the canonical Gospels, and they attest to a historical person, even though they are chock full of
I don't really think they do. I think Mark is clearly allegory, and I
agree. My take is Mark is completely allegorical.
The Gospels are all derivative from Mark.
Right, and some of them, at least Luke doesn't know that.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think that any argument that says that the Gospels reflect a historical Jesus is way off the mark.
Is it? And I don't want to get too far off track. I agree with you guys that Mark is completely allegorical, was intended to be allegorical, and is a quasi-mystery religion document.
Right.
I think Matthew knows full well he's full of shit too. Okay. But Luke, on the other hand, I think goes out of his way to characterize his, and that's assuming that there's one author of Luke. Okay.
Yeah, but if his main source is Mark and he doesn't realize that it's full of shit.
Exactly. I think Luke is the guy who's out of the loop.
Then he's just pretending to be a historian.
Right. He was duped, and he's carrying on a story that was allegorical unwittingly as a historical. He's the one that's out of the loop. He doesn't get the punchline.
I don't buy that, and here's why. I think Luke is deliberately adding stuff that is reinterpretations of Greek literature. Like, he adds scenes that directly parallel scenes from Homer or Euripides.
Yeah, but nevertheless,
he has to be aware that he's writing fiction if he's doing.
Oh, he knows it's BS. I just think he's talking about an actual person that existed, but he's just putting yeast on the story. He's sprinkling yeast on the story himself. He knows he's making stuff up, and he's drawing parallels from other literature.
And his primary source is undeniably Mark.
Right, but I think he thinks Mark is talking about somebody that actually existed. I honestly think so. And I mean, the preface with the whole, to Theophilus, and that he researched all of this stuff and confirmed that all this stuff is true, assuming that the original author of Luke wrote that introduction. I think he thinks he's writing about somebody who actually lived, even though he cribbed from Mark his entire story. And then Drew. You don't think that's what happened?
I don't believe the original author of Luke wrote the introduction.
Okay.
I believe Luke was originally like the Marcionite Gospel.
Okay.
And then it was expanded by the interpolator, probably the same interpolator who expanded the Pauline epistles.
Okay.
And that preface was added at that time as part of combining it with the Book of Acts, which was another later forgery, written by a different person than the original layer of Luke. So okay. Luke has interpolations by the author of Acts, but the core of Luke is by an earlier author.
Okay, and it does not include the preface and the whole "I am a historian" notion.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
To add a little bit of a footnote, certain scholars such as David Trobisch and Stefan Haller posit that it could have been Polycarp who was the final editor. They posit that Polycarp was the best candidate. I'll say that.
Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Don't bother to recap my letter. I'll pick it up as I go along.
Welcome back, John.
Oh, those crazy birds.
We got really
As
far.
long as I can be here, but
I'm glad they survived the fire.
Yeah, so is he.
So we
Okay.
kind of just started jabbing about other stuff while waiting for you to come back, John. So you haven't missed anything on the outline.
Well,
But
actually,
we were discussing the dating of the Pauline epistles and how, if they're early or late, how it would affect karyostasis or not.
Yeah, I just caught the tail end of that. Back in element 28 is where I had one thing I wanted to bring up. Carrier says, blah, 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 about the cognitive dissonance in accordance with element 23. Without denying the evident facts or abandoning deep-seated religious beliefs, and it is reasonable to assume at least some Jews did seek such means without going to such ends, meaning violent ends, then for them only one solution remained, to deny the physical importance of the temple at Jerusalem itself. Now, the problem I have with that is there wasn't only one solution, because Rabbinic Judaism is a wholly different solution. Right?
right, yeah, that's kind of one of the points that I brought up, is I don't see how it necessarily requires that to be the case, like he states. Yeah, I agree with you.
He's not saying that's the only solution. He's just saying that for certain people, that's the only solution they would see.
Yeah. But even so, those people then made a choice, so it didn't seem inevitable. There was like no historical inevitability, I don't think.
I agree.
can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Oh, is anybody in the group like keeping track of areas in the book where there's a general consensus of the group that we might not agree with?
Not that I know of.
We should do a poll. A Dave
Thanks,
Mack poll.
John.
For every element, we should have voted, like red, pink, neutral, black, gray.
That'd be
Yeah.
hilarious.
Actually, I'd be down with that. That'd be fun.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I mean, Carrier apparently checks in on occasion, though he doesn't say anything, because he did vote on one of my polls.
Yeah.
Yeah, in our Hangout, we can go over every element with him.
And he got the wrong answer too.
No, he voted. He voted correctly, in my opinion.
Yeah, we could do it statistically. Here's our analysis of your Bayesian analysis. There's a 50% probability.
But to do it specifically with colored beads would have been just been ironically really fun.
Yeah.
Well, not too long ago, it was a couple years ago, that they had a group specifically where it was about the Gospel of Mark, and we would actually vote. We had 5 different choices in a poll. So, you could say, you could assign them numeric values or color values, however you wanted to do it. But it was always coming up either gray or pink, because there's some people that were always black and some were always red, So
Right.
it always ended up being statistically just right in the middle all the time.
Well, that's almost exactly what happened with the Jesus seminar. Most of the time, it came out gray or pink.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
And it turned out that in the end, only about 20% turned out to be red or pink. So.
Yeah, I color-coded all those votes. And I think it was Young's literal translation. So.
I have a question. I'm sorry. I just want to go back to our little previous discussion. Is there any evidence that there is a community, a Markan community, that actually understood and embraced that version of the gospel and in the allegorical context? Do we have any evidence of that?
Pink.
That actually got Mark the way it was written?
No, we're taking that from modern looking at Mark and just saying what we would get looking at it.
I get that. I'm wondering if there's any.
How the original audience understood it is lost to time. We have no evidence either.
Okay, just wondering if there's any evidence of any sect or community, Markan community, that kind of embraced it in that allegorical context.
Yeah, no, that is allegorical is a modern idea just based on interpreting it, and I think it's a correct idea. But yeah, you have to acknowledge that that's what it is. It's not based on ancient testimony to that effect.
Do you know when the first commentaries on the Gospels were written?
That I don't know either.
The first commentaries on Mark or on the Gospels was probably I'm gonna say Origin maybe.
We do know, though, that some early Christian, some of the later church fathers, I should say, understood a lot of the Gospels as allegory.
Yeah,
but that was a later development.
One of them?
Though. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. But that was a later development. We really can't say that they're getting that from what the first Christian community believed. That would just be conjectural.
Okay.
Most of the theories involve that, though, they do kind of posit a line from, say, like Philo. There's a tradition of allegorical interpretation that might have never actually went away. So, but it's like Wayne said.
Okay. Just curious.
The short answer is no. We don't have such evidence of that.
Okay. And there could be, a carrier might argue, but it was destroyed by the proto-orthodoxy winners. But lost to history.
Or just lost to history is enough. We don't have the positive conspiracy,
Yeah.
Unless we dig something up someday.
Yeah, I hope so. I really do, actually. I keep my fingers crossed that we're going to find more texts.
Yeah, we do find more texts, but they're often not early Christian texts. We found early Babylonian texts a few years back.
I know.
That was really great. Get some of the lost tablets from if it was Gilgamesh epic. We found some lost parts of Gilgamesh epic. Yeah.
So I got my fingers crossed that we're going to find some good bits one of these days.
So element 29, further supporting the previous element, is the fact that what are now called cargo cults are the modern movements most culturally and socially similar to earliest Christianity, so much so that Christianity is best understood in light of them. Now this is one I'm so far out of element on this. I got no idea what to think. I know nothing about cargo cults beyond what Kerry has already told me, and whether I believe him on this or not, I have no idea.
Did anybody ever see Mondo Connie? It's a movie, a documentary of odd stuff from around the world. I think it was done back in the 60s.
Do you know how to spell it?
Mondo. Second word is Cane. I think it's pronounced Mondo Connie.
Okay.
And they have, I think they go to the island where I think it was the John Frum cult was practicing. Anyway, it was made back in the 1960s, and my friends and I, when we were in college, went to see it. And anyway, I can't remember what else was in it. That really stuck in my mind, the whole cargo cult concept. So it wasn't a surprise to me when I read it.
What Carrier is saying does make some sense to me, in the sense that there's an element of soteriology or salvation. There's an element of like that mystery. There's an element of historicizing of somebody who's a myth. There are a lot of elements that are parallel.
Would this explain I have another hang-up. The notion that the Gentile communities would embrace a messianic belief system that was created by a people group that was getting stomped by the Roman power structure. I'm wondering how that works there. I'm wondering how does the folks in Rome and Corinth and you know and so forth and want to join the fraternity of Jewish messianics. I don't understand that.
If I may, this is something that I've been trying to wrap my head around for several years now. The question that as you posed it. It's not so much that they were Gentiles as that they were specifically God-fearers. They were people who were already part of the fraternity by proxy. In other words, these were people who were used to pagan theology and ritual,
Right.
who were attracted to the discourses in the synagogues.
And this greased them into it, in a
Right.
way.
Okay. Okay.
And so it wasn't just the general populace in Rome and the general populace in Greece. These were people who were already part of the fraternity, so to speak, because they were attending the synagogue meetings already. And when the temple went away, something the way that I phrased the question is, why would God-fearers co-opt the temple imagery into a symbolic temple? This is one of the big mysteries of early Christianity to me. And so I'm with you on that.
So this is new to me. So there were Gentiles, non-Jews, who were welcome to commune with Jews in the synagogues?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
It's and it is my opinion that the earliest Christianity consisted almost entirely of these people. It's almost like they saw an open door there. Like it was a whole bunch of the exact. I guess it would be the other side of Jews for Jesus. It would be the exact opposite of Jews for Jesus. It would be Gentiles for Jesus, or Gentiles for, you know what I mean?
Right. No, I mean it makes sense. I mean when you look at a lot of the earliest Christian literature, it's almost all exclusively Gentiles. So.
I agree. I'm with you 100% on that. I think that the entire New Testament was written for Greeks by Greeks.
Yeah. Okay.
Dave, Mac, do you remember in the 70s there was a TV show called In Search of Ancient Astronauts, which was inspired by Von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods? Remember that? It was narrated by Rod Serling.
Right.
But the opening section was about cargo cults, implying that that's basically the same phenomenon. All religions started as a cargo cult of alien visitation. So whenever anybody brings up cargo cults, I automatically am prejudiced against it, as any kind of evidence.
Yeah, because it was sort of a popular thing to back then, and it's sort of in the vein of some of the stuff that's been on History Channel and stuff.
Yeah. Well, we're more sophisticated now, Alien visitation theorists.
If I may add a little bit of a footnote to what we were talking about just a second ago, Dustin, do a little bit of a search for God-fearers.
Okay. I actually wrote that down when you mentioned it.
Yeah, because that's I think that's very crucial to the mystery.
Okay, thanks a lot.
We would call them atheists today.
I don't know. I wonder what we would call them. We would call them hangers-on or groupies or something. So let's see. Should we read the next one?
Okay. So we're on the next section now.
We're on the
Elements of religious and philosophical context.
Okay, number 30.
That was a big element, though. Right? Element 29?
Oh,
Is
with the
that,
cargo
yeah.
cults?
Yeah, but it's more to it than that, I think, right?
Well, do you have something to add to that, or?
I have to skim it real quick. If you want to move on, I can always bring it up again if I see something.
Well, and in Element 29, if I can remember correctly, he's drawing parallels between the modern, or the pre-modern, 20th century cargo cult phenomenon to the earliest Christianity, or at least as far as we can discern, what the earliest Christianity might have been. And if he's correct that it was a spiritual, mystical being, Christ figure, there are certain parallels there where a Joshua Christ figure gets historicized, much like a John Frum or a Tom Navy kind of a person does. So much so that years later there are still people who think that these are real people that existed in history, even though it can be demonstrated that it's just almost a semantic accident.
I'm still trying to connect the dots here because I think honestly these elements are very, very important. And he refers a lot to them when he to support a premise he makes later on in his argument when he's fleshing out his argument. With respect to these cargo cults and these, what you refer to as kind of Jewish groupies, would they have the same anxiety about the temple that the folks actually in Jerusalem would have? I mean, if
no, and that's exactly why they had no problem with transferring the temple symbolism onto just some symbolic mystic kind of.
But actually, from that standpoint, it makes sense. They didn't have that attachment, so therefore
right.
It was easy for them to create an alternative framework.
As a matter of fact, one of the mysteries of earliest Christianity to me seems to be that is like, why would a bunch of God-fearers co-opt this tradition or this God? And the answer is because there was no one there to correct them.
Right. Interesting. Okay. I'm sorry, I digress. I'm just,
No, it's all cool, man. I actually appreciate your input.
Yeah. One of the things that's a major factor in this element is the long-standing analysis of cultural conditions at that time, where even going back to, say, like Kautsky, the Marxist theoretician who actually dealt with like the origins of Christianity. I don't know if you've ever read his work.
No, can you write it? Can you write it on the side chat?
Yeah. Hold on a second. I can give you the link right there. But
thank you.
Marxist analysis, and most of the standard interpretation is that Christianity began as kind of like a lower class movement. Now, recently I've read, and I don't know who is questioning this, but they're saying that not necessarily so. That there was a lot of elites involved, and that's the only way it's made any kind of bridgehead is because rich women were like some of the earliest converts to Christianity and so forth. And if you look at any organization, let's single out the Mormons, where the decision to change their policy on black ministers and things like that came from pressure from other groups, other social factors, but not within. It wasn't a grassroots Mormon movement to say we need.
Right.
This was imposed by other elites on the elite of the Mormon Church. So what I'm saying is that the analysis that underlies a lot of this social theory that Carrier is expounding depends on that analysis that goes way back. That there's these grassroots social movements were the impetus that led to Christianity, where it may not necessarily be so. It might have actually been. And I don't want to sound like that Caesar's Messiah guy, so I don't want to push any kind of conspiracy theories on it, but it just seems to me that that's a debatable area about the social conditions. We probably don't know as much as we can't make that kind of determination, because if you do accept those analyses, then A follows B, B follows C, or excuse me, B follows A, C follows B, and that kind of stuff. There's a chain of logic that is true if your analysis, your initial premises are true.
If your initial premises are true, and that's kind of one of the problems that possible potential problems, though. Like the other day, I was watching with my girlfriend. I was watching. She wanted to watch the old From Jesus to Christ thing. She was asking me about it because she knows that I'm into this stuff, and we were watching it, and there was a point at which they were talking about how somebody was challenging the idea that Jesus was a peasant and an illiterate peasant because of look at how wonderful a town Sepphoris was. It was a Roman town with baths and a library and all this other stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but what does that have to do with a historical Jesus? Just because Sepphoris was near the, was part of the Galilee doesn't mean that this is where Jesus specifically got his. It doesn't mean that Jesus was opulent. It just means that there was a town nearby where there were Romans,
Or Gentiles in general. Like there's that book, The Myth of Gentile Galilee, I believe.
Yeah.
I used to have that. Never read it though. But and also there's another analysis I read where it said that it depends on where you're at. There was a more Gentile Galilee and there was a less Gentile Galilee. So it's another controversial issue.
If the premise is faulty, then the logic is faulty. So you're right about that.
Yeah, and if it's controversial enough to have debates like that, then there's no conclusions you can really seriously draw.
Right, correct. Yeah. But it seemed to me that it was a weak argument to say that Jesus, was literate. The person said he probably spoke 2 or 3 languages, and I'm like, well, you can't say that,
Yeah, that's really reading into it. I mean, there's no evidence at all for that,
And if you're going to use that as your premise for a early Christian background, then that's a problem, Well,
a lot of it is apologetics because they say, okay, we'll grant you that the Gospels and the sayings of Jesus within it couldn't possibly be Aramaic. They were written in Greek. There's every evidence that it was Greek from start to finish. Well, that means then Jesus had to know Greek, right? Because then you're rescuing through apologetics the Gospel accounts.
Of course, yeah. But there's a problem there too because a lot of the narrative in some of the Gospels is meant to be a literary construct that's either ironic or sarcastic or something like that, and it works in the Greek, but it doesn't work in the Hebrew or the Aramaic, let's say,
There's also counterclaims of the exact opposite, so,
Yeah.
But the thing is with the Aramaic question, it's like most people don't realize how much small a part that would be of the overall corpus. I mean, if it was that dependent on Aramaic or Hebrew roots, it would have a lot more evidence, a lot more examples you could pull than the hatful that normally touted. But those are the ones that are hammered over and over, very visible. They do sound plausible, but when you look at it as an overall case, it's minute.
Well,
there
yeah,
would be a lot more evidence.
One of my huge issues with people who use the criteria of Aramaisms, that's a really laughable criteria to me. It's just like, okay, and so if you can detect genuine Aramaisms in a text, and therefore Jesus, give me a break.
Yeah, Dr. Price made that point like several times. What? Jesus is the only one that spoke Aramaic in the first century.
Exactly. That just every time I hear something like that, I just want to cringe.
It's easier to put a rope through a needle than to prove the Gospels were originally in Aramaic.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, what Dr. Price says? He goes, I take that parable literally. The rich can't go to heaven. I mean, it's just about as plain as you can say it,
Yeah.
And here,
And
Dr. Price being conservative,
By the way, it's one of the things that I strongly agree with the character of Jesus on, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, because it's all over the Gospels. I mean, that message, that's not the one place where he makes that message. It's all over the place. So.
Yeah, exactly. The story of Lazarus in Luke, for instance, is another.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, shall we move on then, or?
Sure.
Okay, just in the interest of time. But before we continue, though, John, is there something you'd like to add about cargo cults?
He said, "Be right back."
Oh, okay. Let's see. Elements of religious and philosophical content. Element 30, if I may.
Yes.
Early first-century Judea was the nexus of countless influences, not only from dozens of innovating and interacting Jewish sects, but also pagan religions and philosophies. Now, this is one where the apologists would just freak out, and often do. They seem to have an aversion to the idea of syncretism in early Christianity, and which is what this exactly hints at.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of funny because much of the Old Testament is God bitching out the Jews for syncretism, but for adopting pagan practices. I don't know. I know what you're saying. I've had that same, knee-jerk reaction when I've encountered Christian evangelicals in my circle, but I don't know why that's such a. I mean, what is the objection to that? I don't know. I mean, without even getting to apologetics, is there a scholarly objection to this notion that there was this syncretism that occurred?
Some scholars, I think, like Ehrman, is really opposed to syncretism, at least.
Yeah, what's the argument for that?
Oh, geez. I'd have to look it up.
I think I've heard him say, I mean, there's no... He kind of poo-poos the whole dying and rising God angle, that notion really didn't exist as it exists in Christianity.
But the dying and rising God is just one thing in an ocean of syncretic influences.
Yeah, starting with Zoroastrianism, and moving on from there. Hellenism and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah, from the monolatry to Zoroastrianism, and yeah.
Yeah, the whole idea there, the whole idea of the adversary becoming a personage that we know as Satan now was a direct influence from Zoroastrianism, and I think it's almost undeniable.
Yeah.
You just have to read Philo.
True.
It just seems like they want to draw a line in the sand all the time. It's like this far and no further, We'll allow this, but not that. But
I think it's impossible to read Philo and then read, Hebrews and John and not see that there was an influence from.
Oh, of course, yeah.
It's impossible.
There have been those scholars who actually posit that Philo was almost like an inventor of earliest Christianity when you consider his concept of the Logos.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carrier does this several times in the book where he puts all these elements together and say, well, there's Christianity without X, and he does it 2 or 3 times in the book, I think.
Yeah. But I think that the question that Dostin asked a moment ago is a good question. Is there any legitimate scholarly argument against the syncretic influence, the syncretic influences from paganism specifically on early Christianity? And if the answer is Ehrman doesn't like it, then I'd like to read why Ehrman doesn't like it.
That settles it. Ehrman doesn't like it. That settles it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I got.
I know a lot of the apologetic reasons why, but not the scholarly reasons. I should.
Yeah, I can. If I were to guess one of the reasons why Ehrman doesn't like it, I think it undermines historicity. That you don't need a man walking around for Christianity to come into play. Syncretism kind of is the catalyst, as opposed to an actual man that people followed and then created a cult after. But that's just my guess as to why he's averse to it. But I mean, that's more of a he's trying to play a mind reader.
Does he deny that? He believes in historical Jesus. Does he deny that Jesus was influenced by, just say, Cynic philosophy? Or is he again? Or he believes in the apocalyptic prophet, right?
I think he takes the apocalyptic prophet route. Yeah.
But if he accepts Q, I think he has to accept at least some of the cynic arguments from like Mack and people like that. Not Dave Mack. But another big problem is that, you're also rejecting a lot of things that we know that are part of Judaism that you might say led into Christianity. So you also have to bracket out a lot of antecedents that would also undermine the originality of, say, an historical Jesus. So it's really putting yourself in a really bad position.
So here's some questions maybe you guys can help me with. I'm thinking about the sacraments. Okay, these are very central to rituals in Christianity. The notion of taking wine or eating food or taking bread or meat to represent the flesh of your protagonist. Is there any evidence that this existed prior to Christianity within Judaism? This belief or notion. To me, that screams pagan. And that's been a part of Christianity from a very, 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 from the earliest stages that I can think of.
What specific idea?
The sacrament of the Eucharist.
Yes.
To me, that screams pagan.
I agree.
And I'm just wondering, and funny thing is, the apologists will argue that this practice was from the very beginning of the religion, but it's pagan. At least I think so. Is there any argument, if from a scholarly standpoint, that this practice predated Christianity within Judaism?
I'm glad you bring this up because it touches on one of my earlier objections on an earlier Hangout, in which I complained that Carrier is being too extreme in his saying that we can't say anything about a normative Judaism. I think that even though he's correct that there was no such monolithic Judaism, for instance, this is one really good point where it was monolithic in the sense of, the idea of eating blood would have been revolting to any Jew, and I think that can be said. Pretty fairly.
Even in a symbolic notion.
Because if you have an example of what Dostin's requesting of a pre-Christian Judaic context, then great, go for it. I'd like to hear it, even in a symbolic context.
And on the other side of that coin, do we have examples predating Christianity within that practice in the pagan context?
Yes.
We do have. Okay.
We do the rites of Bacchus, the rites of the Eleusinian mysteries. We have even the Mithraic cult. Even though we don't know exactly what their ritual consisted of, we have pictures of Mithras holding this bowl, and then there's blood coming out of the thing, and so we know that this
is that pre first century.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Wow. That's pretty strong evidence in my opinion. But
I agree. But I mean, apologists. You'll be amazed at the stuff that apologists will throw at you at this point.
Yeah.
All
right. So for I guess element 31 to me seems to be without controversy in my opinion. Okay.
We didn't actually read 31 yet.
I'm sorry, 31. We didn't read it yet. I'm sorry. I see it highlighted there. I'm sorry. Element 30.
I was trying to move on to it.
Gotcha.
Incarnate sons or daughters of a god who died and then rose from their deaths to become living gods, granting salvation to their worshippers, were a common and peculiar feature of pagan religion when Christianity arose. So much so that influence from paganism is the only plausible explanation for how a Jewish sect of Christianity came to adopt the idea.
Well, yeah, this is kind of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yep.
The way I try to, envision this is if could Christianity have popped up, but for if the Roman Empire was not in power and it was a different power structure at the time, is it anything within Judaism internally that would have led to Christianity as we see it today, from a theological perspective?
That's a really, really good question, and I don't think so. I think the answer is no.
I say no. I think it's like a pachinko machine where the ball hits little pins and stuff, where every little pin has its own little random influence on things. And I think there's a huge amount of chaos in the history of religions and what's possible and what could happen.
But it's
It's kind of like the butterfly effect. I know what you mean. Yeah.
It's a really incisive question, though, I have to say.
Well, that's a point that an argument that Carrie would actually have to make. Now, I'm sure it's in here, but I would have to go back and trace with his links, see elements 29, 32, 46, and try to trace it back to see all the different steps that would lead to that. But there's the argument about early what they call the agape feast, the love feast, that were not involved with any kind of sacred meals, but only communal meals, and had no kind of sacraments at all, and that was a later development. So
I think a lot of peculiar Christian doctrines have arisen from just trying to explain peculiar texts that they influenced, they got from Judaism. Like the doctrine of hell and stuff. A lot of that comes from certain Old Testament passages at the end of Isaiah that were just kind of got misread. If those passages weren't there, the whole doctrine may not have developed. And the doctrine of the Trinity is kind of the same way. There's a lot of weird things regarding how Jesus and the Holy Spirit were referred to by authors who weren't really thinking about deeper issues. And when later people wanted to start asking deeper questions, they had to work with what earlier people had written, and it just kind of went in chaotic directions from there.
It was like a damage control kind of a situation where they had to come up with something which would fit the required. They needed to explain. Well, if Jesus is God, then and the Spirit is God, then how does this work?
So will we be in agreement that I want to say it's Matthew where Jesus gives the instruction to baptize believers in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit?
I believe that's an interpolation, by the way. I believe
that was what I was getting at.
The previous verse says, "All authority has been given to me," or all authority you have. I'm not reading it exactly. I'm kind of paraphrasing. Mm-hmm. And taken in the conjectured way, it fits that context better. So then, in my name, baptize people. In my name, teach people, because all authority has been given to me. Mm-hmm. When they add in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost there, it kind of negates the entire point of the authority being granted to him.
Right. Yeah, because he suddenly made himself into a third person.
Yeah. But that's called the Coney Bear hypothesis, and a lot of strict textual critics don't like it because there's no textual evidence for it. It's based entirely on context. Yeah, they don't like arguing for interpolations unless there's actually manuscripts that show weird wording that give evidence of it. But the problem is we don't have any early manuscripts at the ending of Matthew. It's just one of these unfortunate things of history. All our early manuscripts of Matthew are missing the last part. They're just pages missing and stuff. It's just coincidence that's not in our early copies.
Okay, then why not interpolate the passages leading up to that to make more sense? If you know what I'm saying, if why not doctor the whole last passage to if the scribes wanted
because
to.
you only change as much as you have to. You don't want to mess too much with scripture.
And it wasn't
Yeah.
wholly lost, right?
Okay.
It was just not a lot of manuscripts had it, but some did. Oh, also go back to chapter 4, section 6. There's a discussion of the relationship between the Passover and the Eucharist there, but the main, I think, area is in chapter 11, so won't go into that.
Okay.
My point on pages being lost was simply that we don't know what the early manuscript of Matthew said. I
Right.
mean, that for that chapter we have no testimony before like the 4th century, which is actually quite late compared to what we have for other chapters of Matthew.
No kidding. That's
Yeah.
the earliest, huh?
Yep.
Wow. Wow.
Which is interesting though, because if Matthew, let's say, was written, sometime around the turn of the century or whatever, and we don't have, and we have this interpolated sometime after, then the interpolations could come as late as perhaps some of the pastoral epistles, right? Perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of speculating here. And
Yeah.
so let's say Timothy could date to around the same time as this interpolation, which could be seen as an attempt to put it in line with the pastorals.
Conybeare argued that Origen seemed to have a copy of Matthew that did not have the Trinitarian reading.
Who did?
Origen. Conybeare. Conybeare is the name of the scholar, and he's reading from Origen, but the counter to that is that Origen was probably just paraphrasing and not directly quoting. But it looks like Origen had a copy of Matthew that did not have that verse.
I would like to read about that if you have a link or something like that.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Another scholar that Dr. Price mentions a lot is Winsome Monroe, when she talks about the pastoral stratum and the Pauline corpus.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think it's 1 Peter or something. Anyway, the title's similar to that. That's a cool name, though.
It is. I always thought so too. Cool word, winsome.
Do we want to draw the line in the sand?
I have a question for Dostin, though.
What's up?
What brought up that question about the Trinity?
I did. I
yeah.
used it as an example of how just chaos, how Christian dogma comes kind of from accident in many situations.
Right, trying to, exactly. It was trying to make sense of certain aspects of Scripture and create a coherent doctrine out of it, and voila, the Trinity. Okay, I think was maybe was kind of the statement, and the notion was that the Trinity was a later development in Christian theology as an ad hoc explanation for some of the weird references to this Holy Spirit and the Father and Jesus, and they're all being divine or thought to be divine by that time, and how do you reconcile it? And then I said, well, shit, there's Matthew 28, and that's supposedly a late, 1st century, early 2nd century document, and it references the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as if they are on par with one another, and telling the disciples to baptize people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. To me, that's about as straightforward a reference to a Trinitarian concept that I can see in canonical gospel. To me, that's unambiguous, in my opinion, or at least it can be argued, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but if it can be argued that Origen had a copy of Matthew which did not have this citation.
Absolutely.
If that did not have this citation, I really would love to read about that. I would love to see what that's about.
Me too.
Yeah, I don't have a good link to what to read about that, but I know the scholar. I don't remember what decade he wrote, but it's F.C. Conybeare is the main scholar that did a lot of research into that question.
Yeah, and it's also kind of peculiar that the whole entire Gospel of Matthew would go without that reference. You know, if you're just going to with one verse kind of voila, we're all three God, and that's it. You know what I mean? That's kind of
the
weird.
other argument is that the Book of Acts never uses it. If that was really a command given by Jesus to baptize that way, why is Acts never use that formula?
Right.
But
Good point.
to,
But another
to see that formula as Trinitarian is reading modern conceptions back into it, because Matthew could have had a totally different conception, say like a Jewish conception. He might have been thinking of Elohim, Yahweh, and the breath of God, you know, in a totally Jewish term. So if you see modern Trinitarianism in those statements, then I think you're importing much more sophisticated notions than probably were in the mind of the author.
Correct, also.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that Dawson was on the right track, because when he talked about it's all these weird contradictions, like, okay, if Jesus is God and God is God and all this stuff, then what? That's when they put theologians and philosophers to work, and these were like the big brains of their age. You know, they weren't stupid, and they really came up with some Zen concepts, you know, that were like incomprehensible to everybody, but really sophisticated arguments, you know, and that's where that stuff originated. But, you know, it's because of the earlier stuff that they didn't know what it meant either, but for their dogma to work, it has to be a certain way. So, you know, that's how orthodoxy came about. That they were just forming this stuff, not exactly ad hoc, I would say, but definitely evolutionary.
Yeah, that's a good word, evolutionary. I don't want to stay on the tangent too long, but I wanted to mention one more thing on Trinitarian development. Is that we have a lot of quotes in early church fathers, like 5 or 6 instances of the same kind of thing being said, where certain skeptics of the deity of Christ are complaining that it makes it into two gods, into like a binitarianism rather than a monotheism. And the interesting thing about those quotes is they seem to have no concept of a threeness involved in the question. It's like it went from monotheism to bitheism to Trinitarianism in a couple steps, not just in one jump.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually a really strong argument against that. Yeah, I like that. The fact that they're complaining that it makes it into two gods, that's a strong argument.
Yeah.
It's an inference, but it's a strong one.
Yeah. Anyway, we should get going on the outline. It's already 2 hours into the Hangout. Or we can pack it up here and resume here next time, but I'd like to just keep going.
Really?
Well, it's up to you. We can go. We can decide together what to do here.
Well, I vote for like cutting it off at this point. That's my vote.
Okay.
Well, let's cut it. Let's not force John.
Okay.
I'm in command here.
So we'll start at element 32 for next time. I don't know how. Do we want to try to go further then?
Let's
just try to finish.
Chapter 5?
Or
So,
at least to the end of
get to
43
42.
at least, yeah.
Yeah, 43 at least, but we might make it past there.
Okay.
Yeah, let's set the sights high for the entire chapter, but, you know, if we fall short, that's okay.
I'm just trying to count what element is. What's the next logical stopping point past 43? Does anybody have it here?
I don't have it open. Does somebody have it?
What element were we on? 29 or 30?
30. We're on
31.
32.
Yeah.
Started with
geez.
23, right?
Yes.
It's like 144, and the end of the chapter is what? Almost 235, something like that.
48 is the end of the chapter, element 48, so there's not that many more elements.
Yeah, let's just
try to finish the chapter next week.
Yeah, let's shoot for the end of chapter 5.
Sounds good.
All right, cool.
Good having everybody here. This was a great discussion this week. I actually enjoyed this more than previous weeks on this book, so it's good.
Yeah, I think it's all the extra people we have really makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a good sounding board. It's like, you know, we're exchanging ideas more.
Before I hang up, I enjoyed it as well. If any of you wouldn't mind, you can direct message me. This is off topic of the discussion, but I'm very curious to know if there's any more talk in the scholarly circles about this early Markan fragment that was supposedly discovered last year.
They're really keeping it under wraps, so.
Yeah.
It's still G14 classified. Okay, all right, I see.
I think the fact that it's so secretive and there's so much subterfuge and guile about it raises suspicions in my spidey sense. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so there hasn't been much more talk about it since they went dark.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't even know what was it. I never even heard of it.
They claim to have found a piece of Mark in like a
mummy
wrapping kind of a thing.
I thought it was a stage mask, like for theater.
Something like that. But it's kind of like a
paper mache. Like paper mache.
Right.
They took it apart.
Correct.
And it's supposed to be dated to like what 70 or something like that.
Yeah, it's supposed to be dated before our traditional dating of Mark.
Yeah, and there's a lot of controversy over them destroying these ancient masks, which are valuable historical artifacts in their own right, in order to try to recover documents from them. So there's kind of a trade-off there.
Yeah, funded by the Hobby Lobby people.
I like ancient documents. I'm always good, feel happy about them being, rediscovered and stuff. But destroying, ancient artwork to get them is kind of a sad price to pay for them.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I will say though that I would like to date a little corner of P52. I would like to destroy just a little corner where there's no text. I'd like to know when that was written.
Yeah.
But the problem is a lot of these ancient masks have been bought by a far right-wing Christian apologetic group. So, from a critical standpoint, whether we trust their scholarship on these is very questionable.
Right.
The Bible Museum guy.
Yeah, it's the same guy who owns the Hobby Lobby people, the Greens.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Which he's apparently under investigation by for looting, pretty much.
Well, for quite a while there was where those guys claimed that there was fragments recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were in Greek were actually parts of Gospels. Right. And it didn't take much actual examination to find out that was totally wrong. But, it's just really easy to go ahead and make a name for yourself, claim what they're going to claim about this fragment. And, if somebody proves them wrong later on, so what? Because they had their 15 minutes, and whatever financial gain they're going to get.
Yeah, I'll just
people don't read the retractions.
Well, that's the problem.
And that's kind of why I brought it up, to see if there were any.
That's the problem, is people don't read retractions, and to this day, people make claims that were refuted years ago.
Yeah.
And it's kind of annoying, really.
Well, like the James Ossuary?
Yes.
Yeah, there's still people that consider that. Oh, yeah, we found it. We found Jesus' bones and everything.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for watching.
See you next week.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.